There is a house just beyond the tree line at the end of the field. People say it's been there longer than the village itself. No roads lead to it, no paths. Only the curious, or the lost, ever find it. Jacob was neither curious nor lost. He was just tired. That evening, the fog had rolled in early, folding over the hills like thick cotton. Jacob had gone walking to clear his mind after a long week. He wasn't sure how long he'd wandered before the silhouette of the house appeared, quiet as a held breath, behind a veil of mist. It looked abandoned, weathered wood, windows clouded with time. But it wasn't falling down, not really. It looked patient. The front door creaked open when he touched it, like it had been waiting for someone polite enough to knock. Inside, the air was cool and dry. Dust hung in the sunlight like snowflakes. Jacob called out. No answer. But something made him stay. The house was warm, somehow. The floorboards didn't groan underfoot. A fire was laid in the hearth. Unlit, but ready. He sat on an old armchair and closed his eyes just for a moment. That's when he heard it. A whisper. Not from the room, not quite from his ears. It tickled the inside of his mind. A voice like silk sliding over glass. Not words exactly, but intent. Stay. Rest. It's safe here. He opened his eyes. The shadows hadn't moved, but they had changed. They were longer, deeper. And there were more of them than there should have been. Each one too still, too shaped. He should have left. He meant to. But the house was calming. As the hours passed, the fog outside thickened until the windows turned white. The fire lit itself sometime around midnight, with no spark, no match. Just a soft humph, and warmth. The whispers returned. More now. Echoes in the walls, behind his head, under the floorboards. You're not alone. Never alone. He began to see them, the shapes. Standing in the corners. In doorways. Behind the furniture. They didn't move, but he felt them breathing. Jacob wasn't afraid. Not yet. When he tried to stand, the floor stretched away. The hallway was longer than before. The doors were all closed now. Outside the window, it wasn't night. It wasn't day either. Just endless gray. He sat again, sinking deeper into the chair. His name whispered back at him from nowhere. Over and over. Jacob. 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 Sleep was thick in his bones now. He was heavy. Eyes closing. The fire crackled. Then, a soft breath at his ear. You came home. And Jacob smiled. Not because he understood. But because, finally, he wasn't tired anymore. He never left the house. No one does. But sometimes, just sometimes, if you walk too far into the fog, and you listen closely enough, you might hear him whispering back. Jacob tightened his scarf and stepped off the gravel path, boots crunching through the first crust of frost. The town lay behind him, growing quieter with every step. Overhead, the pale afternoon sun blurred behind a slow-building fog. An early arrival for October, thick as cream and slow as breath on a mirror. He hadn't meant to walk so far. Originally, he just wanted to escape the flat, its cluttered silence, the broken coffee maker, the unpaid bills he kept stacking face down like losing cards. But the farther he walked, the easier it became to forget the weight in his chest. He passed the boundary of the field, no name on a map, but every kid in the village knew it, the hollow field. Just beyond the tree line, where the weeds grew higher than a man's waist, something darker waited. Jacob had only vague childhood memories of the stories. They'd dared each other to cross it once. He had made it 2 steps past the birch trees before turning back. The others had laughed, but none of them had gone any farther either. Now, decades later, something drew him forward. Branches scraped his coat like curious fingers. The fog swallowed the last view of the sky. And then, there it was. A house. It rose from the mist like a dream half-remembered. Not ruined, not thriving. It simply was, as though it had always been waiting. The wood was weathered but unbroken. A brass knocker hung from the door like a question mark. The windows were opaque with age, yet behind them, faint glimmers of amber light flickered. Jacob stopped. Logic caught up to instinct and hesitated. He wasn't supposed to be here. Nobody came here. But his legs carried him forward anyway. Something about the place whispered that it wasn't strange to find it, it was strange to have stayed away so long. The door opened before he touched it. Inside, the air was warmer than outside. It carried the scent of pine and dried flowers, and something else, something sweet and decaying, like old apples or wilted roses. "Hello?" he called out. No answer. Just the whisper of the door closing softly behind him. "Let me know when you're ready for section 2, or if you'd like me to continue posting them automatically." Jacob stepped inside, one cautious footfall at a time. The floor beneath his boots was made of old, dark wood, polished not by hands but by time. Dust danced in the slanted shafts of light filtering through warped windows. Though the house should have been freezing, it was warm. Not just warm, inviting. He turned to look back, but the door had vanished. In its place stood a wall with faded wallpaper, the pattern of roses twisted into almost recognizable shapes. His brow furrowed. No panic. Not yet. Just disorientation. Old houses settle, he muttered to himself, though he hadn't seen any signs of settlement. Everything here was too still. To his right, a sitting room opened up, containing two high-backed chairs near a cold fireplace. On a small table sat a china teacup, cracked but clean. A thin trail of dust had been disturbed from the saucer. Jacob leaned closer. The teacup was still warm. He blinked. Behind him, the air shifted, as though someone had just walked by. He spun. Nothing. Just the hallway, stretching longer than it had a moment ago. "Hello?" he called again, louder this time. Still no answer. But a whisper came. So faint he wasn't sure he heard it. Not words. Just breath. Like a sigh in the walls. He turned again and found the sitting room had changed. One of the chairs was now facing the fireplace. The other remained where it had been. The teacup was gone. He hadn't heard it move. Jacob took a step backward. The house exhaled again. He backed into the hallway, glancing down its length. There were no lights, yet he could still see. The gloom seemed to make room for him, like the darkness was considerate. The walls were lined with portraits. Each one blurred, faces indistinct, like oil paint left out in the rain. But the eyes, he could see the eyes. Watching. Following. He pressed forward. A door on the left caught his attention. Slightly ajar. He pushed it open. It was a bedroom. A child's bedroom. Toys from another century lay scattered. Wooden blocks, a stuffed lamb with glass eyes, a rocking horse so old the paint had curled into scales. The bed was neatly made. Then he heard it. The creak of the rocking horse, moving slowly. Back. And forth. He hadn't touched it. Jacob stepped back and closed the door softly. The house was watching. It remembered. Jacob moved carefully, as though the house might wake if he stepped too loudly. There was no electricity, yet each room glowed faintly, bathed in a haze like candlelight behind fogged glass. Dust lay everywhere, undisturbed for years, until now. He came to a hallway mirror. Its surface was clouded, but he leaned in, trying to see himself. His reflection blinked slightly too late. He froze. Waited. Blinked again. Perfectly in sync this time. He laughed nervously and turned away. "Get a grip," he muttered, but his own voice sounded thin. At the end of the corridor, a narrow staircase twisted upward. The banister was carved in worn oak, splinters like teeth along the edge. He ascended slowly, every step met with a groan of old timber. Halfway up, he noticed it, there were no cobwebs. No insects. No mold. Just dust, and silence, and waiting. On the landing, he found a writing desk against the wall, covered in papers so brittle they crumbled when touched. One had a name written over and over again, each line shakier than the last, Margaret. The handwriting grew smaller toward the bottom. One final line ended abruptly, just an M and a smear of ink. Beneath that, scrawled deep into the wood itself, were the words. "Don't let her hear you." Jacob stepped back. There was a door across from the desk, smaller than the others. He turned the handle. It was locked. As he turned away, the knob clicked. The door creaked open by itself. A narrow room. No windows. Shelves of books lined the walls. In the center stood a single chair, facing a wall where hundreds, maybe thousands, of tiny handprints marked the plaster. Each one small. Each one burned in. Jacob stepped closer, heart thudding. He didn't want to touch the wall. But something in him needed to. His fingers brushed the cold plaster. And from behind him, a voice whispered softly. "You're not supposed to be here yet." He turned, but the room was empty. Then the door slammed shut. Jacob lunged for the door, but the handle wouldn't turn. It was as if the mechanism had vanished altogether, no click, no give, just cold, unmoving brass. He pounded against the door, shouting, "Hello? Is anyone there? Let me out." His voice sounded muffled, like shouting into a dream. Then, silence. No footsteps. No response. But the air shifted. He turned slowly. The books lining the walls were different now. The bindings were cracked open. Every page was blank except for one word, repeated endlessly down the middle of each, Margaret. Jacob's breath caught. The air had grown colder, heavy with a damp, metallic tang. The chair in the center of the room scraped backward across the wooden floor. By itself. And then, slowly, the shadows began to gather in the corners. He backed into the wall, eyes darting. One of the handprints, only one, was wet. The shape of a child's palm, glistening as though it had just been placed. Something dripped. "Okay," he whispered. "You made your point." He wasn't sure who he was talking to. The house? The voice? Margaret? The room trembled. A small panel near the floor clicked and swung open. A crawlspace. With no better choice, Jacob dropped to his knees and slid through. The passage smelled like earth and rot. He crawled forward, hearing faint whispers ahead, voices too quiet to understand but layered, overlapping, like prayers spoken backward in the dark. After what felt like forever, he emerged into a different room, a nursery. Not dusty. Not abandoned. Fresh. As if someone still lived there. Toys neatly arranged. Curtains tied with silk ribbons. A mobile above the crib spun lazily, though no breeze stirred. On the walls, hand-drawn pictures. A little girl, a tall house, and someone standing alone in a field. The last picture showed the little girl inside the house, watching from a window. Someone else, stick-thin, featureless, stood at the bottom of the stairs. Jacob stepped toward the crib. Empty. But still warm. And then, humming. A girl's voice, soft and tuneless, floating down the hallway beyond the nursery. Jacob stood frozen. Then, a whisper from behind his ear. "Shoo. She's still watching." Jacob turned around, but nothing was there. Just the quiet thrum of the house breathing around him, timber and dust and unseen footsteps behind old walls. The humming continued, soft and meandering, like a lullaby made by someone who never quite learned the tune. He stepped into the hallway beyond the nursery. It was narrow, much narrower than the others, barely wide enough to walk without brushing the walls. The wallpaper here was different, peeling in wide strips, exposing warped wood underneath. Beneath the paper, something had been scratched into the boards, symbols, faint and strange, repeated like ritual markings. The humming grew louder. He followed. Doors lined the hallway, all shut, each with a name carved above in childlike handwriting. Clara. James. Beatrice. Thomas. Dozens of them. But only one door stood open at the very end. Above it, the name, Margaret. The humming stopped. Jacob hesitated. The room beyond was dimly lit by a single candle on the floor. The flame didn't flicker, even when he stepped inside. The air here felt thicker. Not cold, not warm, just occupied. There was no furniture. Just a mirror leaning against the wall and a set of small, muddy footprints circling it again and again. Jacob glanced down. His own boots were clean. He stared into the mirror. His reflection stared back. But behind it, behind him, stood a girl. Pale. Thin. Hair hanging limp over her face. Not moving. Not blinking. He spun around. Nothing. He looked back into the mirror. She was closer. He stepped away, heart pounding, breath shallow. The candle flared without wind, growing into a tall flame that twisted into the shape of a finger, pointing. Pointing at him. And the mirror cracked, just a hairline, right across his eyes. Then the voice came again. This time, not a whisper. It came from inside the mirror. From her. You need to remember. He stumbled back into the hallway. The other doors were now open, just a little. Enough to see inside. Each room was the same. A bed. A mirror. And footprints, some small, some large. All circling. All watching. Jacob backed away from Margaret's room, his skin crawling. The hallway seemed longer than it had moments ago. Doors stretched into the distance like teeth in a tunnel, each one slightly ajar, each one breathing silence. The candle behind him sputtered and went out without sound. Darkness pressed close. Somewhere behind one of those doors, a floorboard creaked. He didn't wait to find out which. He broke into a fast walk, almost a run, down the hall, past door after door. As he passed, he felt something pull at his sleeve, a fingertip grazing fabric. He didn't look. At the end of the hall, a staircase curved downward, tight and spiral, built of stone. It hadn't been there before. He hesitated only a second before descending. The air cooled with each step. The stone grew damp. Moss clung to the walls like veins. And then, a door at the bottom. Old, iron-banded, swollen with moisture. Unlike the others, this one had no knob. Only a hole, just large enough for a hand. He didn't want to. But he did. He reached inside. Cold, wet wood. And something, soft. Like cloth, or hair. He jerked his hand back, but the door clicked and creaked open. No light spilled out. Just blackness. Jacob stepped inside. The door slammed shut. Total dark. And then. A sound. Not voices. Breathing. All around him. Short, quick, shallow. Like dozens of people huddled in the dark, trying not to be heard. He reached out, fingers brushing skin, a cheek, but it disappeared the moment he touched it. He turned, blindly reaching, but the space around him shifted like smoke. The breathing never stopped. Then came the scratching. Faint at first, then louder. From the ceiling. From the floor. From inside the walls. Thousands of tiny nails scraping to get out, or get in. A voice whispered from just behind his head. "We stay quiet. Margaret listens." Jacob couldn't speak. He couldn't move. Even his thoughts slowed, heavy like the air. Then a single match flared beside his face, casting red light. A figure stood inches away. Its face was hidden beneath a stained porcelain mask. Painted lips curled into a grin far too wide. The mask tilted, as if curious. And then it whispered. "Why did you come back?" Jacob stumbled backward, away from the masked figure, but there was nowhere to go. The walls had closed in behind him, the dark pressing tighter, the air thick with old breath and something that smelled like rust and roses. The match burned down to the figure's fingers. They didn't flinch. The mask tilted again, and the whisper came once more. "You were one of us. Once." Jacob's voice caught in his throat. What do you mean?" The mask leaned closer. He could see its painted eyes now, black, empty wells, ringed in fine red cracks. "She forgets. But the house remembers." Then, darkness again. The match extinguished. Jacob staggered as cold arms brushed against him. Dozens of them, moving past, around, above. The room was full of them. People? Shadows? Echoes? They didn't speak. Just moved. Restless. Ceaseless. He found the wall and pressed against it, searching for the door. There was no handle. No seam. Just stone and splinters. Then, a breath at his ear. "There is always a price to remember." The voice was different. Not the mask. Younger. Sad. He turned his head, and there, in the darkness, two eyes glowed faintly. Child's eyes. Wide. Empty. Watching. The girl. Margaret. "I don't know you," he whispered. But part of him wasn't sure. She said nothing. Instead, she raised her hand and pointed behind him. A rectangle of light had appeared. A door. Open. He didn't hesitate. He ran toward it, through it, up a narrow passageway that twisted like intestines through the belly of the house. The air changed again, less cold, but sharper. Like old paper and candle smoke. When he emerged, he was standing in the foyer again. The door, the front door, was there. Waiting. Sunlight poured through the windows. The fog was gone. Had it only been minutes? Or days? Jacob reached for the handle. And stopped. In the mirror by the door, he saw his reflection. But his eyes were wrong. Too wide. Too still. Behind him, in the mirror, the girl stood at the top of the stairs. And all around the house, doors began to creak open, one by one. Jacob stood frozen at the threshold. His reflection in the mirror didn't blink. It only stared, mouth slightly open, as if whispering something he couldn't hear. Upstairs, Margaret remained still. Her thin arms hung at her sides, and though her face was obscured by shadow, Jacob could feel her eyes inside his bones, studying, remembering. The doors behind him continued to open, hinges groaning like waking throats. Each creak deeper, slower, more deliberate. A rhythm. A summons. He gripped the doorknob. It was warm. Too warm. He turned it slowly, click. Nothing happened. He pulled. The door didn't budge. He pulled harder. It didn't even rattle in the frame. No resistance, just stillness. As though it wasn't a door anymore, but part of the wall. Or of him. From above, Margaret whispered. "You can't leave until you remember." He turned toward her. "Remember what?" She began descending the stairs. Slowly. Deliberately. With each step, the house seemed to pulse. The light from the windows began to fade, dimming not with night but with some invisible hand. Dust rose in lazy spirals from the floor, catching in Jacob's throat. "Why are you doing this?" he asked. But the girl didn't answer. She stepped onto the first floor and moved past him into the foyer, trailing shadows like a veil. As she walked, the floorboards didn't creak beneath her weight. They sighed. She stopped before one of the newly opened doors. The room beyond was dark, but something inside pulsed like a heartbeat. She turned to him. "You were here before. You stayed too long." "We all did." He shook his head. "That's not possible. I've never." But the words died. Because he had seen that hallway before. In dreams. Or nightmares. Fuzzy fragments of a place he couldn't name, a child's voice calling from down a corridor that never ended. She stepped into the room. He followed. Inside, the walls were covered with writing, tiny, cramped lines etched into every surface. His name was there. Over and over. Jacob. 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 Don't forget. Don't forget. One message stood out, carved deeper than the rest. "You said you'd stay. You promised." He turned toward Margaret. She was gone. But in her place, the mirror had returned. And this time, the reflection wasn't his. It was a boy. Younger. With his face. Crying. Section 9 follows next. The boy in the mirror wept silently. Jacob stared, transfixed. The child's features were his own, smaller, softer, but unmistakably him. The same scar on the eyebrow. The same wide-set eyes. But there was something else. A kind of sadness that went deeper than fear. It was abandonment. The boy raised a hand and pressed it to the inside of the glass. Jacob raised his own. They did not match. The boy's hand stayed still when Jacob moved. His lips parted. And he spoke. Not aloud. Inside. "You left me here." Jacob staggered back. I don't remember." The boy in the mirror screamed. But no sound came out. Only dust, pouring from his open mouth, flooding the mirror's surface, spilling into the room. The walls quivered as writing peeled from their surfaces and fluttered into the air like dying moths. "Don't forget. Don't forget. Don't forget." Jacob choked, waving his hands in the air as the dust thickened, clinging to his face, his lungs. And then, everything stopped. Stillness. Silence. He opened his eyes. He was in a different room. Smaller. Cleaner. Familiar. It was a bedroom. His bedroom. But not now. Then. Old wallpaper with green vines. A toy fire truck. A night light in the shape of a bear. He was in his childhood home. No, not home. This was the room he had lived in before the foster system. Before the fire. He hadn't thought of this place in decades. How was it here? He turned, and the door opened. A woman stood there. Her eyes kind, her hands trembling. His mother. But not as he remembered her in life. She was pale, skin paper-thin, eyes shadowed. Like a candle still burning after the wax had run out. "Jacob," she said softly. "You always said you'd come back." He fell to his knees. No. No, you're not real. You. She knelt beside him, touching his face with fingers that were too cold. She remembered you, even when you forgot. But the house doesn't forgive, Jacob. It never does. Behind them, the mirror reappeared. In its surface, Margaret. Watching. Waiting. And smiling. Jacob stumbled backward, away from the mirror. Away from the image of Margaret's pale face, expressionless, eyes hollow yet focused entirely on him. His mother's hand lingered on his shoulder, but her voice had changed. Quieter. Distant. You don't belong here anymore, Jacob. You broke the promise. He turned to her. Her face was fading, edges blurring like smoke. Her form melted into the wallpaper of the room. Vines climbing up her arms until she was part of the house again. Part of the memory. And then she was gone. He stood alone. Except he wasn't. Because someone, or something, was knocking. Knock. 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 The sound came from the closet across the room. Not urgent. Not violent. But steady. Like someone who knew they'd be let in eventually. Jacob approached, heart pounding. As he reached for the handle, he hesitated. A child's voice whispered from inside. You left me in the dark. He flung the door open. There was no one there. Only stairs, descending into pitch black. Not part of the house. Not part of any house. Stone. Cold. Winding down into earth that had never seen light. Jacob stared, breathing shallow. He took one step down. The door slammed shut behind him, plunging him into darkness again. But now, he remembered something. He had been here before. Long ago. A game of hide and seek. He'd hidden in the closet. It had creaked open into this passage. He had gone down, not knowing why. Just curious. Just brave. The house had shown it to him, just once. And when he returned, no one believed what he saw. Not his mother. Not the social worker. Not the other children. Eventually, he had forgotten. He had needed to forget. But now, the house wanted him to remember. Each step downward was slower than the last. The air smelled of soil and iron. Somewhere below, water dripped steadily, echoing like a ticking clock. After what felt like hours, he reached the bottom. There was a door. Unlike any other. Tall. Black. Bound in chains that writhed slightly, as if alive. No handle. No keyhole. Just a name carved across it in shaking lines. Jacob Elijah Moore. He reached for it. And the door moaned. The moan of the door was not mechanical. It was organic, like an animal stirring in its sleep. Jacob's hand hovered inches from the wood. The name carved into the surface looked fresh, the grooves red and raw, as if it had been carved from the inside. He didn't want to open it. But he already knew, this wasn't a door that waited for permission. With a slow, breathless groan, the wood shuddered and cracked open, not outward or inward, but like a mouth parting at the center. Behind it, nothing but blackness. Not the absence of light, the absence of reality. Still, something drew him forward. The deeper part of the house. The part it kept locked until it trusted you. Jacob stepped through. At first, there was only dark. Then, colorless shapes began to take form, barely distinguishable from the void. Figures. Dozens of them. Suspended in the air like marionettes without strings. They turned slowly, as if drifting underwater. None of them moved their heads, but all their eyes locked onto him. Children. Young men. Women. Eyes sunken. Faces pale. Skin thin as paper. And among them, Jacob saw himself. Not a reflection, but another version, a younger one. Standing motionless. Eyes empty. A faint smile on his lips. And he remembered. This wasn't the first time he'd come here. The house had taken part of him before. The frightened boy who'd wandered too far, who'd whispered his name to the dark, who'd promised to stay and keep Margaret company. And when he'd left, he hadn't left whole. He had grown up, forgotten. But the boy had remained. Now he was back. And the house was offering a trade. Behind him, a voice said softly, "We only take what you leave behind." He turned. Margaret stood there. Older now. No longer a girl, but not a woman either. Her limbs were long, wrong. Her face emotionless. "Why me?" he whispered. "You were the first who came willingly," she said. "You saw us. You listened. Then you forgot. I didn't mean to." "You all forget," she said, stepping closer. "But we remember everything." Jacob's knees weakened. "What happens now?" Margaret's smile was faint. Cold. "Now, we put you back together." The suspended figures began to drift toward him slowly, like leaves in thick water. Jacob felt a pressure in his chest, not pain, not fear. Recognition. Each one of them had eyes that knew him. Not in life. Not in memory. But in some deeper, older place. Margaret walked among them with reverence, as though they were sacred. "They were all like you," she said. "Pieces that didn't fit. Forgotten children. Broken memories." She reached for one of the floating figures, a young boy with hollow cheeks and dirt under his fingernails. Margaret brushed her fingers against his forehead. The boy opened his mouth, and from it came Jacob's own voice. "I'll never leave you." Jacob staggered backward. "That was me. That was my voice." "You promised her," Margaret said. "Before you learned how to lie." She pointed toward the Jacob double still standing among the figures, still smiling faintly. "You left that part behind. You left him here. And we kept him safe." Jacob turned, breath quickening. "Why are you showing me this?" Margaret tilted her head. "Because you need to choose." The chamber began to change. The darkness melted away. The house returned, but not as it was. Rooms unfolded around them like paper catching flame. Hallways flickered into view, warped and elongated. The house wasn't made of wood and stone. It was made of them. Every whisper. Every forgotten child. Every unfinished promise. The air crackled. A door appeared before Jacob, tall and bright. Sunlight poured through it. A path out. Freedom. Behind him, the boy, his boy, lifted his eyes. Spoke again in Jacob's voice. "If you leave, I stay." Jacob shook his head, tears rising. "No. That's not fair. I didn't know what I was doing. I was just a kid." Margaret stepped closer. Her eyes, those ancient, bottomless eyes, filled the space between them. "Then make a different choice." The boy's small hand reached out to Jacob. Jacob stood between the door and the mirror of himself, the grown man and the boy split by time and memory, by guilt and forgetting. He had left the house. But part of him never had. And now the house wanted to be whole again. It always did. Jacob stood motionless, caught in the trembling stillness between the door of light and the boy's outstretched hand. The open door called to him. It smelled of sun-warmed grass and fresh wind, reality. Escape. But behind him, the chamber breathed like a lung. The figures turned slowly in the air. Watching. Waiting. Margaret watched him most of all. "If I take him back, Jacob asked, voice raw, what happens to this place? Margaret blinked slowly. It will miss him. But it will survive. It always does. And if I leave him here? Her expression didn't change. But the chamber grew colder. He stays asleep. The house keeps him quiet. But he'll know. You'll both know. The boy lowered his hand slightly. His eyes, not pleading, not angry. Just tired. And Jacob knew. The whispering never stopped because it had always been his own voice echoing down the halls, calling back through years of forgetting. A part of him had cried out in dreams, in fits of quiet dread, in moments when the world didn't quite feel whole. This house had lived in him. And now it asked him to live in it again. I don't want to come back here, Jacob said quietly. Not ever again. Margaret gave the faintest nod. Then you must take all of you with you. Jacob stepped toward the boy. He knelt. Reached out. Their fingers touched. The moment they did, a pressure rushed into Jacob's chest. A terrible warmth, like fire through bone, memory flooding in. The closet. The whispers. Margaret's humming. That first time he had stepped too far into the dark and had been caught between pretending and truth. The boy closed his eyes. And dissolved into him. Jacob collapsed to the floor, gasping. And when he rose, the house had gone silent. The figures in the air stilled and faded, dissolving like breath on glass. Margaret stood alone, now distant, framed by the pulsing dark of the chamber. She said nothing. Only watched. Jacob turned toward the door. He placed his hand on the frame. Sunlight warmed his palm. And as he stepped through, he heard, just once, Margaret's voice, not in anger, not in triumph, but in a whisper like a lullaby. Thank you for keeping your promise. And the door closed behind him. Not just sunlight, but daylight. Real and vibrant and warm. The fog had lifted. The trees stood tall around him, leaves trembling in the breeze. Birds called distantly. The earth was soft beneath his boots. The house was gone. Behind him, nothing. No structure. No door. Not even the old trees that once marked the boundary to the hollow field. Just meadow. Stillness. Open air. He turned in slow circles, blinking against the brightness, half expecting the sky to tear open, for the dream to pull him back in. But nothing came. Only the wind. His hands shook. He looked down at them. Older. Worn. But his. Whole. He had not felt whole in years, maybe ever. There had always been something missing, something off-kilter inside him, like a song that starts and never finishes. He thought it was trauma. He thought it was loss. Maybe it was. But it was also this. That place. That promise. He walked. The village came into view. Smaller than he remembered. The houses looked softer now, quieter, as though time had grown shy. He passed no one on the way. Just fields. Trees. Sun. He reached his apartment just as the clock tower struck noon. The keys in his pocket felt heavier than usual. The lock clicked home like a heartbeat. Inside, everything was as he'd left it. Coffee maker still broken. Bills still stacked. The world unchanged. And yet, he had changed. He moved to the mirror above the sink and stared at his reflection. For a moment, just a moment, he saw the boy again. Smiling. And then he was gone. In his place, only Jacob. Fully himself. Fully present. No whispers. No humming. Just breath. He exhaled. The house was gone, yes. But it would never be nothing. It would wait. Not because it needed him, but because others forget too. And if they listen long enough, if they stray too far into their own quiet pain, they might hear it. That faint sound in the distance. The creak of a door. The whisper of a name. The rustle of a promise broken too long ago. And the house will open its door again. Because the whispering house is never truly empty. It only waits. Like a lullaby without an ending. And sometimes you come back.